Help support AMTV by becoming a patron, an AMTV staff member, and following us over on Twitter. Hi there guys, it's Adam Martyn here, and today we're going to be talking about lost media, specifically lost media linking to Channel 4. Now, I wanted to discuss this because I saw this fantastic blog post on the Transdiffusion website. Now, if you're not familiar with it, it's a great website for TV history, particularly here in the UK. Their blogs have helped me out a lot with research for certain videos over the years, so definitely go and check them out. But this article is titled as Whatever Happened to the Channel 4 Archive, and the author is Philip Renfrew, which I believe is a writer's pseudonym. Just before we get into the article, in terms of lost media, I know that's been a subject of like a big surge of interest from people all across the world, you know, not just UK lost media, US, all around the world. And in lost media here in the UK, I think, you know, some people assume that whilst there was widespread junking of material in the 50s, 60s, and even into the 70s, I think some people think that, say, by the mid to late 70s, going into the 80s, that, you know, all broadcast media was archived, it does exist in some form, we can access it, etc. But unfortunately, that isn't really the case. I mean, you've got to remember, programs were made on some form of analog media for such a long time. It wasn't really until, when would you say, like the late 90s, 2000s, when digital started to come in and it became somewhat easier to store and archive these programs. And in fact, today, lost media can still occur if these programs, especially ones that say are only accessible on streaming, disappear without a trace, they aren't archived properly. So lost media, sadly, is still very prevalent. And this one is talking about Channel 4, which of course launched here in the UK in 1982. So again, you know, by the 80s, you think, okay, we've learned how to store things on videotape or film, we've learned our lesson, we're going to archive everything. That's not necessarily true. The article starts by saying it's not possible to answer the above question without at least some historical context. In truth, the first 15 or so years of Channel 4 gave rise to some of the most richly diverse programming in British broadcasting history. It was prepared to take risks, leading to both spectacular failures and extraordinary successes. And just that ethos of Channel 4, I've talked about it before, I think that is the prime ethos that Channel 4 should continue with. I mean, it turned 40 last year, it sort of outlined that remit as well, and it still does. It still puts out programs which are very, some would say risky, some would say that the other broadcasters would never do, and sometimes it really works, sometimes it really doesn't. But when it talks about Channel 4's beginnings, you know, that was the intention. It was going to be the indie station, as it were. The indies were going to take over. However, the article says it wasn't meant to be so. The ITV companies were intended to do most of the heavy lifting for the new channel, with the indies having a much smaller supportive role. Jeremy Isaacs, C4's first Supremo, felt obliged to make sure that every ITV company got at least one slot in the first year's output. Each was having to contribute 12.5% of their revenue, that's 1/8, to the station's running costs, and it was felt wise to give them something in return. Yeah, it's interesting to note that that first year of Channel 4, even though it was this indie focus, that a wide variety of the programming was supplied by the different ITV regions. So, you know, back then ITV, that name was still there, it referred to the other side, but it was all the independent companies who were producing for them. Well, independent, they were also very rich. So, you know, like Yorkshire, Granada, Thames, London Weekend, all those. And, you know, we've covered that on the channel before, so you can go and check that out if you want to learn a bit more about them. And some of it says a lot of them were perceived as failures. There is one that I've seen that I would disagree with. I think it's called One Summer, and it's this great 5-part drama series about these two boys who run away from Liverpool to the country. And it was written by Willie Russell, who of course famously wrote Blood Brothers, the famous musical. And that was on Channel 4 in the summer, I think, of 1983, so its first year, produced by Yorkshire Television. And that is a stellar bit of drama. So I'd say not all of them were failures, but yeah, it seems the ITV companies were definitely contributing, as it says, the heavy lifting for that first year. There is a strong case to be made that the indies were the real driving force in Channel 4's reputation for innovation. Initially, they comprised a myriad of relatively small companies, many of which were literally one-man bands. In later years, Channel 4 increasingly used a smaller pool of preferred contractors, but it's likely that thousands of different production companies worked for Channel 4 in its first couple of decades. The programming collectively created by the indies in those early years is arguably a body of work that was unprecedented in both its scope and ambition, and yet, as this article will aim to show, is now demonstrably the most fragile part of the Channel 4 archive in terms of survival and accessibility. So yeah, in terms of that body of work that's really unprecedented, you've got to remember the BBC and ITV at the time were really catering for the mainstream. Now, yes, the BBC's remit is to cater for everybody, but, with ITV, you had the big glitzy shows, a lot of the, had Coronation Street, Emmerdale, all that sort of stuff. That was really going after, well, some people, I don't agree with this term for the record, but some say ITV at that time was going for the lowest common denominator. Again, don't necessarily agree with that term. And the BBC, in some respects, was trying to play catch-up, whilst also trying to cater to other audiences. And they could do that quite freely, more so on BBC Two. But Channel 4 was really wanting to push the boat out. It was trying to cater for, groups that maybe didn't feel represented, but doing it in a very, sort of out there, risky way, but different from the norm, certainly. It brings us to the question, what exactly has become of Channel 4's early archive? We can ignore the many imported shows such as I Love Lucy that were always part of the monthly schedules. Our interest is purely in British-made product that was created with Channel 4 in mind. And there are 3 categories this article breaks down. There is ITV-made programmes, producer-funded programming, and Channel 4-funded programming. So it addresses the ITV chunk of the Channel 4 archive first. It says the rights to ITV-made programmes remained with the various regional ITV companies that made them, Channel 4 only having UK broadcast rights. A lovely example would be the Tyne Tees 1988 production The Industrious Bee, a film's 6-part step-by-step guide to beekeeping, possibly the only one of its kind ever made for British television. This is why, people say British television is so weird, but, we would make programmes like this, programmes that are so incredibly niche, but, obviously have an audience out there somewhere. So that programme, for example, The Industrious Bee, okay, Channel 4 has UK broadcasting rights, but the ultimate rights to it reside with the original company, Tyne Tees. It also points out London Weekend, how they were key early suppliers with pieces like the sitcom No Problem and classic period drama Mop and Lucia. And most of these programs are now owned by ITV plc, which is like the big company that controls ITV now, and safely held in their Leeds-based archive. So, it's saying that a good amount of these ITV-made programs for Channel 4 are still in existence. They're in an archive with ITV itself, so that's reassuring to see. There are a number of exceptions, however. By way of example, Fremantle now owns most of the former Thames television archive, including their many Channel 4 productions, and TSW's archive is now held by Plymouth-based organisation The Box. So not everything ITV made back then is under ITV's ownership. Again, these were independent companies that were sold off, so Fremantle owns Thames, and obviously The Box controls the archive for TSW, so it seems that they are archived, but not necessarily under ITV itself. It goes on to say a far more complicated and unhappy situation exists with the Channel 4 productions made by former ITV company Television South, or TVS. Because of a series of commercial mergers over the last 30 years, it's no longer clear who owns the rights to the TVS archive, much of which is also missing. Some of their Channel 4 programmes, but not all, are held by the British Film Institute, or the BFI, at their National Archive. And one example of a lost Channel 4 programme would be the 1983 documentary series The Spice of Life, made by a TVS subsidiary, Blackrod, at a cost of $1.2 million, which is no longer believed to exist in broadcast quality. And that's such a shame. Again, this is 1983. They'd figured out how to store things on videotape or in film, and yet, through all these company mergers, TVS being amalgamated into other companies and not knowing what's where, it seems like this, it sounds like it exists, but not in a broadcast quality, which leads to the bigger question of analog media, how, even though it's great we can store these things on film and videotape, but this stuff degrades, eventually it degrades, and especially, in this case it's been 4 decades, that stuff is probably on the edge as it is. And then sadly, if you're a big TVS fan back in the day, it says the copyright limbo that surrounds TVS's Channel 4 productions means that even those which do exist in broadcast quality are unlikely to see the light of day. And that's sad. Just from a television history point of view, like trying to preserve all that media, that's such a shame. It then moves on to the second category of programmes, which were solely funded by the original production company, so the indies, if you like. So from Channel 4's point of view, this was a very similar arrangement to the one with ITV. Channel 4 would pay them a licensing fee, likely to include up to 3 screenings in like a certain time frame. Otherwise, ownership would remain entirely with the producers, many of which had been set up to serve the new market which had opened up with the advent of Channel 4. It says, in the intervening decades, many of these production companies have long since been dissolved or absorbed, and the whereabouts and rights status of their programming consequently clouded in obscurity. That's the only major thing with indies, isn't it? If they're absorbed or bought, you'd like to think whoever amalgamates them would archive their material or really take pride in preserving it. However, when it's dissolved, it's much more tricky. Unless you're dissolving and selling off your assets and all that to another company, if you're just shutting down, no one wants to buy, then that stuff is going to get increasingly harder to maintain. It says the situation with these Channel 4 funded programmes is complex, to say the least. In a nutshell, we don't know for sure how much of it still exists. Again, some historical context is required, and the industry magazine Broadcast, which we've mentioned before, noted in 1986 that a contract with Channel 4 ensures that all of its programmes will be deposited with the BFI archive when transmission rights expire. So that was a contract as of 1986. That was a contract that Channel 4 had, that it was all going to go to the BFI. But it seems, again from how this blog's been written, that that wasn't always the case. It says the BFI does indeed hold a great deal of Channel 4's early programming, and according to their online archive catalogue, started to receive tapes in great quantities in the early 1990s, so around 10 years into the channel's existence. And certainly, a great many Channel 4 funded and owned productions from the 80s and 90s are to be found at the BFI. Many of them have been digitized. And, thankfully, obviously, when you digitize media, it still has, its failings. Hard drives can corrupt, things can fail. But the argument, I think, is that preserving it on digital media is certainly a lot safer and at least more long-lasting than analog. It says the reality is that a significant proportion of the BFI's Channel 4 holdings are still held only on the original 1-inch broadcast master tapes, many of which are now 35 to 40 years old and increasingly fragile. It's not clear if there's any specific selection policy on part of the BFI that has determined which tapes have been digitized and which have been left to gather dust. Either way, it has received wisdom within the industry that there's only a limited amount of time left in which to save programming held on these obsolete analog formats. So sort of like what I touched upon before, this stuff is fragile. It's not going to be around forever, or it's not going to be in broadcast quality forever. And some would say, well, why doesn't the BFI just, digitize everything in their archive? It does cost to do that. Transferring analog media into a digital format it can be expensive depending on the program, how much restoration work is needed. If it's degraded to a point it needs severe restoration, that's going to cost money. And the BFI is an institute, like any organization like this, it'll be on a specific budget. So I'd like to think they do what they can when they can, but they have to make some tough choices for sure. It says the situation gets even more complicated. Over the years, Channel 4 allowed the rights for some shows to revert to their original makers. At one point, this was a matter of policy. So in 1986, the Channel 4 executive Bill Stevens made it clear that rights to programs which weren't likely to sell abroad could be returned to their makers, which, you could argue that's a kind gesture in one sort of sense. It does also note roadblocks that have been put in the way of independent producers, even, to this day, who want to maybe access their past work for Channel 4. The station will no longer readily just consent to rights reversion of older programs, even for material that is unlikely to have any obvious commercial potential. And added to this, producers wishing to obtain master copies of their programming from the BFI are asked to pay hundreds of pounds per tape for digitized copies. For small-scale releases, such fees are likely to be commercially prohibitive. I wonder why Channel 4 does this, because, again, for say something right back in the 80s, it's not likely to have a massive commercial potential, as it makes clear there. Why not just revert those rights back to the independent producers, for example? And, people say, the BFI charges too much. Again, listen, they're a business. They've got to make money somehow. But yeah, for a lot of small-scale ones, especially the one-man bands, as it mentioned, that'll just be nigh on impossible. Going back to rights issues, it says that, Channel 4 International was sold in 2007, and as part of that, the overseas rights to almost all Channel 4 funded programs were sold to the Digital Rights Group, and now they are believed to be owned by All 3 Media International, and a consequence of that is a very large block of the early Channel 4 output has two entirely separate rights holders, which is far from ideal in the age of global streaming. People wonder why things disappear and reappear on streaming sites at the click of a finger or a touch of a button. It's often down to rights and who owns what rights in what territories and how long they last for, etc. It concludes by saying the net result of all the above factors is that the greater proportion of Channel 4's older back catalogue remains behind closed doors. There are a few exceptions to this, of course. There is a little classic Channel 4 content on the 4OD and BritBox platforms, and there are, of course, still a number of DVD releases of older Channel 4 programming available. And it mentions that in an unlikely development, every episode of Brookside is now available on the STV player. Yes, I remember reading that. That seems really odd. So Brookside was a soap opera that launched on Channel 4 on launch day on the 2nd of November 1982, and it lasted for 21 years. It finally came to an end in 2003, and every single episode of that soap is now available on STV player, which is the in the Scottish ITV, if you like. So if you're in that region, then you're having a great time. Its last little paragraph says these are very much the exceptions. Much of the archive is unaccounted for, much of it is undigitized, and a fair chunk of it is in copyright hell, and some is simply lost. and almost all of it is unavailable for the general viewer to enjoy, which is arguably a cause for great regret, given the rich and extraordinary range of programming that Channel 4 made in its glory days. It is a shame, the stuff that's been lost, sadly, there's nothing we can do about that. If it hasn't been preserved in some way, if it's not on, a dodgy VHS in someone's attic, then it sadly seems like it will be lost forever. The stuff that's not digitized, again, that is worrying because these analog formats do degrade, and, you just worry that some of these programs people want to go back to from Channel 4 and enjoy, they might not be able to in a decent manner after a few more years. And, the copyright stuff, well, that's just a nightmare, especially if it's split between multiple rights holders and, the ITV companies and all that sort of stuff as well, like we mentioned. It's just such a shame because, again, reading about Channel 4 as a channel, you read about the sorts of programs it had. You read about how it really pushed that mold, particularly during the 1980s and into the 1990s. And the fact that a fair amount of that history, that groundbreaking stuff or that boat-pushing stuff, we can't watch anymore. Or we can't watch it freely. You either have to pay a high amount in license fees, or it's just not likely to come out at all. It's a real shame. So it frustrates me that a lot of Channel 4's early history is going to basically be marked as lost media. Even if not all of it is lost, it's around, but our chances of seeing it are extremely slim. But yeah, I just wanted to talk about this blog because obviously lost media is a very interesting topic as well, and I thought it just gave an insight into how we preserve media, especially, in this country. We're so lucky to have something like the BFI, which is responsible for saving hundreds, if not thousands of programs and films and all sorts. But let me know what you think about this in the comments down below. Do you think more of Channel 4's early archive is likely to be released to the public in the near future? Do you think more lost media from the channel will turn up? And, if you've got any VHS tapes in your attic that you recorded, maybe have a look. You might find something on there. Also, leave a like on this video if you enjoyed, and subscribe to the channel. We'd really love to have you aboard. In the meantime, I've been Adam Martyn from AMTV. Thank you for joining me, and I'll see you next time. Thank you to our patrons for helping to support the show, and a special thank you to Macra, Hooks Media, Ben Freeman, Ethan Carberry-Holt, Bruce Danton, Globe of Reviews, Derek Chambers, Sean Knock, Dord Khan, and Fabina UPC V2.0. Our AMTV staff members.